Hi, my name is Shira Rubinoff. I'm here with Clay Moody, Senior Director, Security Research at Secureworks. Clay, such a pleasure to be with you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. So Clay, today we're going to talk about exploring detections and the threat detection lifecycle. And that is a topic that all organizations are pretty much dealing with today and different aspects of it. And I'm really happy that we have you here today to really get into the nuts and bolts of it and explain it to our audience about what you deal with, how you deal with, and really explaining it from the ground up. So to that note, can you please describe to our audience what a countermeasure is and what is the complexity involved with it?
Sure. A countermeasure is any type of system or activity or process that you have in place that can take an action in opposition to something that's happening on your system. It could be a detection capability that generates an alert, or it could be a block or a deny or disrupt some type of action that is happening on your system. So that's what a countermeasure is. And what does it take to build one? It all depends on what type of event you are trying to counter. But if it's something you just want to log or detect, you would have to create it in some type of research environment where you understand what you want to look at, and you build it and you look at that result that occurs from the countermeasure, and you decide if that is what you want to happen, if it's a true positive or if it's a true negative, meaning that it didn't catch what it was supposed to, or it could be a false positive, meaning that it fired for something it was not supposed to detect. And so there's a lot of interactive kind of back and forth where you tune countermeasure to make sure that it is as properly executing as you intended it to be.
So determining the value of a countermeasure, that is something also organizations struggle with. There's a lot to deal with when it comes to the security posture of an organization, and certainly it falls under two umbrellas, being proactive as well as reactive in cybersecurity posture. So this would kind of fit under two umbrellas, but more under the reactive piece, correct?
It can be. It can be reactive in that it causes a user or an analyst to take an action, or it could be reactive in that it is doing something in the system on your behalf that you could be aware of, but it doesn't require a human to react to.
Well, that's important, obviously. So how do you determine the value of a countermeasure, not just deciding, okay, this is what we need to happen if ABC occurs? What is the value scale of that?
Sure. So most of the time when we talk about countermeasures, we talk about the fact that they generate alerts. And the word alert is actually interesting because it's a noun, it's a verb, and it's an adjective. So you can become alert as an individual through the action of an alert being something that alerts you to this fact. But really, it's about raising awareness that there's potentially something suspicious or malicious going on in your environment. And how well it performs that is to make sure that what you want to really know about is escalated to a user's or an analyst, knowledge base, and not necessarily overwhelming them, and you get what's called alert fatigue, where you're not necessarily able to find what is truly suspicious or malicious in your environment, because you just get overwhelmed with too much information, and then you're just sort of paralyzed and making decisions.
Would you say that's part of educating your organization from within the organization itself, but also the customers?
Sure, there's a lot of education about how to understand that sometimes things are really hard to detect, and sometimes even though you can detect something, you don't know the intent. So tools that an administrator uses, the exact same tools that an adversary could use. And so just because something occurred on your system, you don't necessarily know what was the meaning behind that. And so the more insights you can gather, and you can educate your users to understand, when you see this type of an alert, this is the other type of alert you might be looking for, other type of activity you should find if it truly is malicious versus an intentional authorized activity that's occurring inside your network.
Well, I love that you highlighted intent. And I think that's something organizations really need to focus on. Like, what is the intent of it? How are we able to follow through post that? How are the steps taken based on the intent shown? And what does it really mean? So I think that's a really important point that you covered. So thank you for that. And how do you use research to inform countermeasures for detecting threats in customers' environments? Now, that's also, I guess, a part of not just education, but research on the end of the organization But again, we have to inform the countermeasures there. How do you do that for detecting threats in a customer's environment?
Sure. So a lot of the research that we do around detections and countermeasures, if it's organically or inside something that we generate ourselves, we take an adversarial approach, under type approach, and so we'll do what's called a purple team research project, where we have an environment that is instrumented with our various detection capabilities, and we have intentional adversarial activity by our red team happening inside that environment, so that our blue team can observe the telemetry and observe the information that's coming to them based off from the sensors, so that we can look for specific threads that we can pull through that telemetry to make very smart detections and alerts for seeing that activity. And then the adversarial simulators, the red team, they will actually, when they see that they are detected, they will change their techniques in which they are performing these actions to try to avoid those detections, so that we can then create more detections. And so it's a cat and mouse game going back and forth, just creating the strongest type of countermeasures that we can.
Well, that's really incredible. It's really a learning process, I suppose, with the teams working almost hand in hand, not really against each other, but a learning process in order to make the best proper protocol that you need to happen within organizations. So that's really neat. So what has been your biggest challenge in dealing with countermeasures? And, everyone talks about stories. I've heard these stories and that stories. I know you can't mention any names of companies, but what is a really cool, interesting story that I think our audience would love to hear from you?
Well, I think, going back to the purple team kind of assessment back in December with the log4j or the log4shell vulnerability that kind of consumed a lot of our industry at the time, we interacted in that we conducted that same interactive process of writing an exploit to see if, or to take advantage of this vulnerability that was released, and then detecting it, and then going back and forth, where we detect the first version, then they make a second version, to do continue to iterate. But what we saw is a lot of scanning activity in our environment, where everyone from adversaries to actually system admins to just curious researchers started just throwing this malicious payload that was out there across multiple networks and just generating tons and tons of noise. And what we saw was that just because you receive this malicious traffic doesn't mean that your system was vulnerable to it, but people would see this, the presence of the scanning activity and really be concerned about it. And so we started having to connect dots and say, well, if this malicious traffic comes in, this is the type of traffic we expect to see going out to indicate that we've been compromised. And then how can we stitch those together? But it was really great. And, one of our partners said, this is when it's helpful to have a bad guy around, so that you can actually do these interactive tests.
Well, how important is it, the act and react? You're dealing with different types of attacks coming, or different types of information coming your way that might look malicious. And as you talk about, there's tons of noise going on, or people trying different things. Maybe parts of it could be almost insider threat. I'd call negligent insider threat. Somebody just not informed well enough about what they need to do if something should happen. So they kind of play around with it. How important is it communication between organizations, groups within organizations, almost the digital transformation within organizations?
Well, I think what's really great is to have a place that you can experiment and you can test outside of your production environments, a range environment, a playground, a sandbox, depending on what kind of term you want to use, and being able to use those types of environments to test out and learn, and to just not be afraid to break things. And obviously, you wouldn't want to do that in a production environment, because you don't want to break whatever type of service or utilization you have of your platforms, but you also don't want your security provider to have to be chasing down false positives, because anytime we spend activity looking at stuff that isn't malicious, steals us of the opportunity to find the real badness in our customers' environments.
Very interesting. And lastly, is there any other thoughts you'd like to share with our audience, whether it being any specific pointers, any thoughts around this topic, or any thoughts around cybersecurity on its own right from your perspective?
I think, as a former educator, what I'm really encouraged by is all the different learning platforms that are out there that can take you from having no knowledge to having a basic understanding of cybersecurity, but then taking a very seasoned veteran and being able to take it to the next level. And many of these things are crowdsourced, provided by the community, provided for free of charge, and it's just a really interesting community to be a part of. And so I would encourage anyone out there who's just interested in any type of cybersecurity field to just, to look on the web and find these resources that are available to you to learn is how to get started, because it does take playing around and tinkering with it yourself in order to really understand the basics and to just really get a good foothold in this industry.
Well, that's some great advice. Well, Clay, it was a pleasure speaking with you today.
I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, you too.